Oh, we're live. That was, see, that's what you gotta do. You gotta shut it off and turn it back on.
Have you tried unplugging it?
That's how that works. So, hey, Chag Sameach to everybody out there, all of our long distance members. It's great to see you. Of course, I can't see you, but you can see me, and we have students here in the class in the green room as well. Tonight where are we? We're still on the fourth day of the Omer. It's not dark yet, but it will be probably by the time the class is over. Anyway, so we're still on the fourth day of the Omer. The season of the counting of the Omer you should know about is beginning with the day after the first Yom Tov of Passover. So beginning on Nisan 16, because the Yom Tov, the holiday, the holy day of Passover is on the 15th, and then in diaspora we also keep the 16th. So beginning on the 16th, which is the day after the Sabbath of the Passover, the first Sabbath of the Passover, we're supposed to start counting off the days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to heaven. We're supposed to count all the way to the festival of Shavuot. Hi, Carrie. We're going to be addressing your question, so yeah. So you should got to be here in person, right? Or your question's going to be addressed. And so I was just explaining the concept of counting the Omer. That we have this harvest ritual. I'll read about it in the text in a moment. But first, let's get to Carrie's question. The question really boils down to this. In Messianic Judaism, we know about Passover. We got a good handle on Passover. But when does a Messianic Jewish synagogue like Beth Immanuel observe the resurrection of the Messiah? So we associate his death with Passover because of the narratives of the Gospels. And so then actually we associate his death with the preparation day, Erev Pesach, usually is the way that we do it here at Beth Immanuel. But then when do we take time to observe his resurrection? So a couple suggestions. We could do it on the first day of the Omer, and I'll give you a reason for that. We could do it on the day after the Shabbat of Kol Moed, the Sabbath that falls during the week of Passover. And I'll give you a few reasons to do that. Or we could figure out when's the rest of the church doing Easter, and we could, maybe do it then. Or what about this feast of first fruits that we hear about in some Messianic Jewish literature? So here's Carrie's question as she submitted it. She says, I'm curious why we didn't have a resurrection service tonight, which would have been Sunday night.
I think so.
Yeah. Since at sundown, it began the third day. Or is it that it should have been Omer 1 or the Feast of First Fruits? When would the Feast of First Fruits be anyway? Or is it after the Sabbath of Passover or after the weekly Sabbath? So all of the things I just mentioned. Right. And that's what she says. She says, I've heard arguments for all of the above over the last 30 years. And a guest asked me when we are celebrating the resurrection, and I didn't know the answer. Okay. Fair enough. That was actually a good answer. That's a good answer. I don't know. Right. So let's discuss, first of all, this question of when to observe, when to remember, when to celebrate the resurrection. And there's two options. There's probably more than two options, but there's two options that are commonly presented. Thank you very much. You will not lose your award. Awesome. All right, there's two options that are commonly presented that we've presented here. The first one is, like you said, on the first day of the Omer. So let's start with learning about the Omer and try to get that picture I'm going to read, actually, I'm going to read from the ESV because it has that heading. Shalom pointed out to me that right in the ESV, when you turn to Leviticus 23, which is our biblical calendar, and you look down at verse 15, there's a subhead over verse 15, a little, one of these little section headings that actually, it's good to know the section headings are not part of the original manuscripts, which is we were just talking about before class started. These were an innovation that were introduced with the New International Version of the Bible back in the 1970s, I think it was, and it was rather a scandal in the church when these headings came in, because the main argument was, what if the heading is wrong? Which is a legitimate concern. What if the heading says Jesus cancels the law, and then or something like this? You see that sort of thing in some of these Bibles. Jesus overturns the kosher laws or something, where the translator has completely misunderstood the gist of the text. Okay, that's what we have here, where it says the feast of first fruits. The feast of first fruits. So that's verse 9. Leviticus 23, verse 9. The heading right above it says the feast of first fruits. So the first thing I want to clear up is that there is not, well, I shouldn't say there is no feast of first fruits. There is, actually. It's Shavuot. We find that name, Bikurim, a festival of Bikurim, is applied to Shavuot in the book of Shemot. I didn't look up the reference on that, but in this passage, it's actually not called the festival of first fruits, the feast of first fruits. Actually, it's not a Yom Tov at all. It's not a holiday. It's also not technically, I suppose you could say it's a moed, but it's not really an appointed time. Rather, it's a small, it's part of Passover. It's within the festival of Passover. It's part of Passover. It's not independent of the week of unleavened bread. In fact, the whole point of counting the Omer is to connect the observance of Passover with its atzeret, that is its conclusion, which is Shavuot. So, like on Sukkot, we celebrate Sukkot for 7 days, and then there's an 8th day that's called the atzeret, the conclusion. Likewise, Passover is a 7-day festival. Where's its 8th day atzeret? It's Shavuot. It's separated out by the counting of the Omer. So first thing right off the bat, it's not actually called the Feast of First Fruits. It's actually part of Passover. And what is it called? It's called the Omer, and it's called the day after the Sabbath. There's a very famous argument about what is meant by the day after the Sabbath. There's a very big argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But the Pharisees won the argument, and the day after the Sabbath is understood to be the day after the Yom Tov, the holiday Sabbath of Passover. So, in other words, the day after the 15th of Nisan. Nisan 16. The Sadducees would say, well, why didn't you just say the day? Why didn't you just say Nisan 16 then? Why does he use this cryptic language the day after the Sabbath? But that's not the point. I'm going to read the text here. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest. So that's where the word is, first fruits of your harvest, but it's not the word bikurim, which is important. Your bikurim is the first fruits that you bring from your crops, from all your produce, from the 7 species. You're supposed to bring up your bikurim and present them in the temple in that one ceremony that's described in Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, where you put them in a basket, you present it to the priest, and then you say, my father was a wandering Aramean, and so forth. This is not quite that. Instead, it says the reshit, the beginning, the first of your reaping, the first of your reaping. So the idea is that we have come through the year to the point where the cereal crop is going to start being ready in the land of Israel. And barley is the first to ripen. And so before any of this new crop of the barley or the wheat or whatever the harvest is that year, before any of that is kosher, the first sheaf of it needs to be offered in the temple to Hashem. And this is the ceremony that we're reading about, is the offering of this first sheaf. And that sheaf amounts to a unit of measure that's called an Omer. And that's why we call it the counting of the Omer, because the counting starts on the day that we bring the Omer, okay, into the temple. Does this make sense? I'm going to just give you so much information that it might get confusing at some point. Feel free to ask a question or to interrupt. All right, so that's what's going on. It says, you reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first of your harvest, the beginning of your harvest, to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before Hashem. So a wave offering, just like we do with the lulavs. And so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And on the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb, a year old, without blemish, as a burnt offering to Hashem. And the grain offering with its shall be 2/10 an ephah. And so then there's a drink offering that goes with this of wine, a quarter hin. And you shall eat neither bread nor grain, nor grain, parched or fresh, until this same day, until you have brought this offering. It is a statute forever throughout your generations and all. So the Mishnah tells us that the vendors of grain who are already harvesting were just waiting for this ceremony to take place. And as soon as this ceremony took place in the temple on the second day of Passover, as soon as that happened, the markets opened and the new produce was being sold. So it's like, this is what, it's kind of like this offering opens up the way. Okay, so this is a very significant moment in the festival of Passover. It's like a little appointed time inside the big appointed time, right? And it starts us off, it tells us as we read on, you shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord. And so now the wheat is ready, and we're going to do pretty much the same ceremony with the wheat. So we started with the barley, and we end with the wheat. And that's what this span of time is about. And that's why we have, agriculturally speaking, that's why there's this delay of 50 days, because it takes longer for the wheat harvest to come in. All right, so this is, if we take this symbolically, and in reference to the resurrection of Yeshua, it's certainly significant that we can coordinate the resurrection with this date. That it just so happens, according to the Johannine reckoning, that is the narrative we read in John, it just so happens that Yeshua's resurrection from the dead would have occurred on the same day that the priesthood was bringing this first harvest of the barley. And so you can imagine like how the apostles would internalize this and interpret this and say, like, the master's resurrection was like, the first harvest of a future resurrection that's going to take place. It's the breaker that opens up the way. And so when Paul uses that kind of language, we make the association with this ritual when he says, in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, Mashiach has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. Mashiach, the first fruits. And after that, those who are Mashiachs at his coming. So after that, another resurrection, which I think hints towards, this later ritual at Shavuot. So it works theologically. It works very, very well. And like I said, according to the Johannine reckoning, where in the Johannine reckoning, you understand, Yeshua rose from the dead on the 16th of Nisan, the first day of the Omer, because in John, his Seder meal is not a Seder meal. It's not necessarily a Passover meal in John. Instead, it's an early memorial meal before the festival. It says specifically before the festival. And so according to John, he died on Nisan 14, and Saturday then would have been Nisan 15, right? And then he rose after Shabbat was over, Nisan 16, which is the day that the Omer is offered. So that's how that works. Yeah.
So that's day one.
What do you mean?
The counting of the Omer.
Yeah, day one of the counting of the Omer.
I thought he rose on the 17th, and that coincided with when the ark rested.
Wait. That's the Synoptic Gospels. Okay, so Carrie says, but I thought he rose on the 17th. But listen, according to the Synoptic reckoning that we get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, according to that reckoning, the Seder was definitely a Passover Seder meal. So he died on Friday, Nisan 15. Saturday was Nisan 16, the first day of the Omer, Holy Saturday, still not resurrected. And then he rose from the dead on Nisan 17, which would have been Sunday, and the first day of the Omer, according to the Sadducean opinion. Okay, so that's how you get to the 17th, is just by following the Synoptic reckoning.
At one point in time, I believe we followed the Sadducees.
Yeah, and that's how we did that. That's how we fished that all together. Yep, you have to, if you want to have your cake and eat it too. And of course, it's a kosher Passover cake. But if you want to have your kosher Passover cake and eat it too, you have to use the Sadducean calendar, the way that they reckon the.
I thought we started out following the Pharisaic and then said that I remember the explanation why we went to the Sadducean. So somewhere along the line, we went back to Pharisaic.
I don't ever, no, it's just, we inherited, when we started this whole journey at Beth Immanuel, we were following the tradition according to what we had received, and according to what we had received at another Messianic congregation. And that was the Sadducean reckoning. And so it was through, this is a whole nother discussion, but it was through scholarship that we engaged with in the book of Acts, in Josephus, in Philo of Alexandria, that we realized, you know what? The Sadducean reckoning isn't how it was being done in the first century, not in the days of the apostles.
Moreover, then also just the testimony that we have in the book of Acts, that they were not trying to overturn the traditions, because the false witnesses were coming and saying they're trying to overturn our traditions.
Right. Yeah, so, right, we don't see them bucking the system. Anyway, but that's a whole nother conversation, and even we can get into the conversation if we wanted to, which we don't, about how to reconcile John and the synoptic narratives and figure out what's going on. Are we working on two different calendars here? Is this a Pharisee versus Sadducee type of fight? And that's how Rob Lichtenstein explains it. It's another topic for another time. It's another good question. Thanks.
I think that's why I'm so confused, because I came up through the original reckoning.
Sure. No, that's not why you're so confused. It's way more. There's way more confusion to come. So let me get into that. Where are we here? I was still presenting two options that you might follow for observing the resurrection in a Messianic Jewish synagogue. So the first one is, you could say, we're going to do it on the first day of the Omer, according to the reckoning of John. Or if you're a real stickler for the synoptics, you could say, we're going to do it on the second day of the Omer, according to the reckoning of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay. Either way, my point is, you could correlate it with the Omer. The second way to do this is to go with an observance on the day after the Sabbath that falls during the week. So the day after the weekly Sabbath, not the Yom Tov, but the Shabbat that falls during the 7 days of unleavened bread. So Pesach can start on different days of the week, just like your birthday can be on a different weekday from year to year, right? Because it's a solid calendar date. So since it can start on a different day of the week, that Shabbat, because 7 days long, you're going to have a Shabbat in there, aren't you? You got to have a Shabbat in there. It's 7 days long. There's only 7 days in a week, right? So very often that Shabbat is going to come in the center of Pesach somewhere between the two Yom Tovs that start and finish the festival, right? Shabbats. And so we call that Shabbat Kol HaMoed, which means the Sabbath of ordinary and an ordinary appointment, I guess. Yeah.
So you're saying the day after Shabbat, is that the evening of?
Yes.
Or is that the day? Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
It's the evening of. Okay. Yeah. So the advantage then to doing that is to say, look, this is how the Gospels present it. They don't present the resurrection of, and it was on the first day of the Omer, very early in the morning. Instead, they present it as, and it was on the day after Shabbat, right? And so that became the tradition of part of the church. It was the day after Shabbat. And eventually that became the whole first day tradition, and the whole Sunday observance, and everything kind of grew out of that. Yeah, Easter Sunday and Sunday, just like Sunday observance. And so that's the other option. And it's really attractive for a couple of reasons. One is that on that Shabbat, the Shabbat of Chol HaMoed, we read Song of Songs. We read the beautiful poetry of Song of Songs, which speaks to the heart, and it kind of whispers about springtime and new life and resurrection. And then we also read Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones, the resurrection, the very prophecy of the resurrection from the dead. So liturgically, it works really well. And then we come to Matthew chapter 28, the book of Matthew, as it narrates the resurrection. Matthew has a very truncated version of the resurrection. But it starts like this. It says, now after the Sabbath, there that is, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week. And you might think when it says towards the dawn of the first day of the week, it means towards the dawn of the first day of the week, but it doesn't. Instead, underlying this translation is the Greek text preserves a Hebrew idiom that is when it was brightening towards the first, but the idiom is for Havdalah, when you're transitioning from the end of the Shabbat into the beginning of the new week on the first day. And so Matthew, from that reading, is placing the resurrection around the time of Havdalah at the end of the Sabbath. Now, of course, the tomb is not discovered by the women until the morning, but before dawn. They go before dawn, and it's already empty, right? So when did he leave the tomb? Well, according to Matthew, the whole thing happened early on, or late Saturday night, after dark Saturday. So that's the first day. We have some evidence that the early believers actually had an observance of the resurrection on Saturday night, they would gather for a sacred meal at the hour of Melave Malcha. That is the meal that comes after Havdalah, the first meal of the week, also called the meal of King David, the meal of the Holy King, the meal of King David. That they would gather for this on a weekly basis, and this was, not in the synagogue. This would be in a private location, in a private home. They would gather for this meal, and remember, it was exclusive. It was exclusive just to the brothers and sisters, and they would remember the Master with the cup and the bread. They'd remember his death and his resurrection. So we see this happening, and then they'd have some teaching and such at the meal. We see this happening in Acts chapter 20, for example. That story of Paul teaching in Troas on the first day of the week, but it's nighttime. It's nighttime, and that's when Eutychus falls out the window because Paul teaches past midnight. So that's when we think it was an extended Havdalah, sacred meal. So this is kind of how we've modeled our service here. For the remembrance of the resurrection after that. So on Shabbat Chol HaMoed, we come together at Mariv for Havdalah time, and we light the candles. It says in Acts 20 there were many lamps in the room, so we have a candlelit service, actually in imitation of the Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and so forth. And so we borrow their tradition with the little candles, and we sing some songs and open the ark to represent the rolling away of the stone and the big moment and so forth. So it's very nice. It's really nice observance of the resurrection. But it doesn't work every year because not every year has a Shabbat Chol HaMoed. This is a problem. When wouldn't you have a Shabbat Chol HaMoed? I just got done saying you'd have a Shabbat. You always have to have a Shabbat. It's a 7-day festival. You're going to have a Shabbat. So why wouldn't you have a Shabbat Chol HaMoed?
Passover.
Yeah, right. Okay, you're all correct. That's what happens. The 7 days of Passover begin and end with Yom Tov. And then we add an extra Yom Tov for the 2nd and 8th day, right? So you have these Yom Tov days that could land on that Saturday. And that's what happens. When that happens, it mucks it up. And then we don't have Shabbat Chol HaMoed. And then, we can't have any fun with our waving our candles around and so forth.
Ironically, this year it totally lines up with what everybody else is doing in the world.
Oh, yeah. It does that from time to time. Yep, it does that from time to time. So this year, the first day of Pesach was on Sunday. And that means that the 7th day of Pesach will be on Shabbat. So you see, there's no Shabbat Chol HaMoed. There's no ordinary time Shabbat in between there. And so we can't do all of those observances, but we'll still do whatever observances we can as we transition from the 7th day to the 8th day. This Saturday night, we will still do a resurrection service. It's just not going to be the same. That's all. Okay. So that's the answer to your friend who said, when are we doing a resurrection? Are we doing a resurrection service? The answer is yes, this Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat for the 7th day of Passover. Okay.
I noted that it said you won't be doing candles though.
Probably not. Yeah.
I mean, if there's a
That's
candle lit for the Yom Tov and that sort of thing, could we light it from that?
So it's probably,
it's a halakhic question. So you'd have to have a reason to. It's like you couldn't just light it to have it be pretty. You'd have to light it in order to go light your stove or something like that, or to cook with, and it's a difficulty.
Marking the resurrection of the Son of God would seem to be kind of a pretty significant.
you can't put out candles on Yom Tov.
So we all have a birthday candle.
You have to carry it and get burned out on it.
We are marking it, but there is no mitzvah or even established precedent within our Messianic tradition to say, well, we always have to have candles or we didn't observe the resurrection. We just light candles. That's all. It's kind of like I didn't get birthday candles on my cake. I guess it's not my birthday. It's like that's not how that works. But in any case, to answer the question, we will do this Saturday night, but it's going to be different. Okay, we'll still do the Psalms, we'll still do sacred readings, and we can figure out a way to wave around some candles. We'll do that. But let's address another question. Let's go back to this idea of when did the early believers celebrate the resurrection of Yeshua? Because they must have. And I already brought up the Saturday night argument. Some argument can be made that they remembered and I read about this in Oscar Scarsani's book about the temple. Where else? Raymond Brown writes about this in his book on the death of the Messiah. So it's something that's out there. I'm not just making this stuff up. Okay. Anyway, that's the idea that it would happen weekly. But was there ever an annual remembrance of the resurrection of Yeshua? And it turns out there was. And this is what I want to talk about for a little bit. In just a minute, here's another option for remembering the resurrection of Yeshua, because and this is the one that we actually have evidence that this is how the early communities of Yeshua followers did it. And this is why we have the evidence, because it appears in Eusebius's writings. He records the issue because it was a big fight in the church about when to celebrate the resurrection. And so he takes notes. He's the scribe. He's Constantine's scribe. He takes notes and he presents the arguments from earlier generations about this. And so he gives us, he tells us about an argument that was happening between the assemblies of Yeshua in Asia Minor. Those are Paul's assemblies, John's assemblies, the assemblies that are addressed in the book of Revelation and such. So the assemblies in Asia Minor, and then the assemblies in the West, and that would be the assemblies under Rome, okay? And the argument is the assemblies under Rome are saying, he rose on the first day. We should be doing it on the first day of the week. It should be on a Sunday, man, right? That's what they're saying. Okay, and the assemblies of Asia Minor, they're objecting and saying, no, we're going to do it the way the apostles taught us, because we had the apostles here. The apostles were in our cities, and we are keeping the tradition exactly as they handed it on to us. And this is what they taught us. They taught us to observe the 14th of Nisan. And because of that, they were called the 14ers. This by the Romans.
So they were observing the crucifixion on the 14th.
Well, they then rolled right into Passover. But yes, they were observing the crucifixion on the 14th, and then they'd roll that night right into Passover with their observance, right into the Seder. So Polycarp, he was early 2nd century. Polycarp is a disciple of John. Actually, he has some relationship to John, and I think Polycarp, is Smyrna. He was the bishop of Smyrna, I believe. And according to Eusebius, Polycarp maintained it's necessary to keep the 14th of the moon according to the gospel as handed down by the apostles. And that was his directive to his community. And then as this argument with Rome emerged, Polycrates, Polycrates. Yeah. It's like Socrates. Yeah. Polycrates, he says, in his argument with Rome, he says, we observe the exact day, neither adding nor taking away. And then here's his appeal to authority. For in Asia Minor, great luminaries sleep, who shall rise again. And then he starts to list them. And he's in Hierapolis. So he says, Philip, one of the 12 apostles, and 2 of his aged virgin daughters. Moreover, John in Ephesus, who leaned on the master's breast. And so he's saying, we received this directly from the apostles. So what did they receive? Well, they received the tradition that you remember the master's death on the 14th day of Nisan. That is Erev Pesach. That is the day that the Passover lambs were sacrificed. That's the day of preparation for Passover, okay? The 14th day of Nisan. It's the day that starts with Berikat Chametz, the casting out of the leaven, the 14th day of Nisan. And it's also the day on which there's something called the fast of the firstborn. If you're a firstborn, you fast through that day all the way to the Seder. So the Seder begins that night after sunset, the 15th. Then if you're a firstborn, you would fast to that Seder, and so you break the fast with Kiddush at the Seder. Anyway, Polycrates was leading this opposition to the Roman dogma of it should be on a Sunday, and he lost. Eventually, he lost that fight. So the Quartodecimans, their observance fell off under Constantine, I believe, is the one who sealed the deal on this. But so what they would do is they would start their fast on Nisan 14, and they would fast from dawn until dark. Not just firstborns, but the whole community would fast. And they would fast until breaking the fast with the sacred meal. They'd have some sort of Seder, some sort of sacred meal together in remembrance of the death and the resurrection of Yeshua. And that was it. And then, they'd probably go on and keep the rest of the festival, the rest of the festival, of course. But as far as the remembrance of the resurrection of Yeshua, it wasn't separated out like, well, we have to wait 3 days and then remember. Instead, it was all one thing at Pesach.
On the 14th.
No, on the 15th. It'd be the 15th by then. They fast through the 14th. You see, there's a problem here because the church doesn't follow that Jewish reckoning of the day beginning in the evening.
But you call them the Quartodecimans, you talked about the 14th. So
Yep. Right,
if
but
they're doing it on the 15th, why are they called the 14ers?
I'm explaining. They did it on the 14th. They're called the 14ers because the church doesn't understand, it doesn't observe the tradition of the Jewish day begins in the evening. So it is the 14th.
So they still think it's the 14th.
It's the 14th till midnight by Roman reckoning. All right. So that's how they would reckon that. But in Judaism, we would say as soon as the sun sets, it's the 15th. But nevertheless, they began their vigil, what they called their vigil, began at dawn on the 14th.
I was going to say that maybe it's also, so like what we call Passover is like the Seder begins on the 15th at night. But Passover is really, the Pesach is really a reference to the offering that's made on the 14th.
Correct.
So, so when they would ask,
When is
the
Pascha?
early Christians and everything would go to the rabbis to ask them, when is the 14th of Nisan, to find out.
That's right.
That was the real problem with the church, is that they were going and respecting the authority of the rabbis.
Right. And so that became an issue because here's the problem with the 14ers approach to things. Like you said, you relied on the Jewish community for the information of when you were going to be celebrating the Pascha, which is both, you're celebrating both the death and the resurrection of Yeshua under that word, Pascha, but under the idea of Pesach. This requires information from the Jewish community because of the intercalation of an extra month every so often. It was impossible for the church to know when Passover was going to fall that year without relying on information from the Jewish community. And so this kind of like married the church with the synagogue in a sense. So when the Western churches tried to resolve this, when they did resolve this, they wanted to see the resurrection celebrated on a Sunday, or on the first day of the week, which is reasonable, as we saw in the text. That's a reasonable approach. And so what they would do is they would fast on Good Friday, on Holy Saturday, and they would conclude their fast after dark on that Saturday night. Same tradition. So it wasn't like a sunrise service. it was, and this is still the same in the Orthodox Church to this day, by the way. So they would conclude their fast, their vigil around midnight, and celebrate the resurrection then with a special mass and break their fast together as a community. But this, like I said, this required the Jewish community to intercalate the calendar. And so at the Council of Nicaea, that's why Constantine has his famous quote when he says, "Let us have nothing to do with the reprehensible Jews," because he doesn't want to rely upon the Jewish community for fixing out, the date of Pascha, of the resurrection. Let's have nothing to do with the detestable Jews, he says. And so they fix the resurrection on the first Sunday after the first full moon, because Nisan 15 is always a full moon, right? So we're going to go with the first Sunday that comes after the full moon that occurs on or after the vernal equinox. And so that is how you get Easter. That's the date for Easter to this day. And that's how that works out. So usually that's going to line up pretty close with Pesach, but not every year.
Some years he rises a month before he dies.
Right. Some years is like there's a month separation, right? All right. So those are all. I'm just giving you a whole bunch of information now, and we can ask which of all of the above that I just dumped on you is the correct way. Because we want to do that, we want to do things the correct way, right? And I would argue that the Quartodeciman way is probably the correct way. That's the one that was received by the apostles, handed down by the apostles, attested to by multiple witnesses that was the case. And so, what is the Quartodeciman way? The Quartodeciman way is that you would take on the fast of the firstborn, and you would break that fast at your Seder. And then at the Seder, you would remember the death and proclaim the death of the Messiah over the bread and over the wine. And then you would also remember the resurrection of the Messiah in the course of the Seder. And so you would bring in, and that's how the Seder goes, by the way. The Seder starts at a very low point. We were slaves in Egypt. It starts in a very emotionally heavy material, has all the bitter herbs and all of that sort of symbolism, but it ends in this explosive joy of the Hallel and the proclamation of salvation. So it's almost like it's engineered for something like this. He does say, "Do this in remembrance of me." Yes, exactly, precisely right. And so I would say the advantage here is that there's a clear historical precedent, and then there's no extra observance that needs to get tacked on as a duty to Rome or as a duty to Constantine to say, okay, we'll also keep the first day. But on the other hand, there's a disadvantage to this. And the disadvantage is that there's already a lot going on at a Seder. There's already a lot of things to remember at a Seder. There's these 15 steps to get through. There's a lot of chaos. There's especially you're trying to entertain the kids and keep them awake. And so it's not necessarily the best environment for having that special moment. You know what I'm saying? Which is an argument for doing this second Seder, a second night, which corresponds with the Omer, by the way. If you hit the second Seder on the second day of Yom Tov, which corresponds with the Omer, just like the best of both worlds going on there. Okay, so that's I think we could say that's probably the best. That's the optimal thing, is the quarter-deciman way. What about after Shabbat, the way that we do it here? Yeah, that also is pretty good. The Motzi Shabbat, that scratches the itch of, I want to have a special remembrance that's just, more dedicated to this, to the biggest event in human history, the resurrection of Yeshua. But there is a disadvantage. And the disadvantage is you don't always get a Shabbat Chol Hamoed every year. All right. But then neither of these is really the end of the story. Because what Passover is really about is it's like one thing. Passover is one thing that is supposed to escalate through the entire week to the high point of the festival being the seventh day, the last day of the festival, when we celebrate the crossing of the Red Sea, and we read the text of the crossing the Red Sea. And it's on the last day of the festival, by the way, that Hasidus has come along and said, we should keep the last day of the festival as a special day regarding Mashiach. Because on the last day of the festival, we read the prophecy from Isaiah 11 about the Mashiach. And so we have the tradition of a special Mashiach Seder, a Mishteh Mashiach, the Mashiach Suda, on the last day of the festival. And this is also just soaked in resurrection imagery. And so my point is that there isn't really a correct spot to do this. It's not written in here. This is when you should do the remembrance of the resurrection of Yeshua. We don't get that. Instead, we, like the quarter-decimans are doing themselves, we associate the festival of Passover, of Pesach, with the resurrection of Yeshua. And the festival of Pesach is 7 days long. For 7 days, we're eating this incorruptible bread, this stuff that never goes bad, the incorruptible bread of the resurrection, the born again bread. I like to call it. And not only that, not only the 7 days of the festival, but really the festival is not actually over until Shavuot. There's 40 days in which the risen Messiah was appearing in the midst of his disciples. And so it's like there's 40 days of Easter. There's 40 days of the resurrection during which he's appearing to the apostles. And then the ascension is considered to be part of the whole package. The ascension happens on the 40th day, and then 10 days later, Shavuot, the outpouring of the Spirit. And that's the whole package. And so I think that's a better way to look at it, as like this whole season is a celebration of the resurrection of Yeshua. So that's my answer. It's a great question. And obviously it like touches on a lot of stuff. And I hope it was thoroughly confusing. And because that's the correct answer. The correct answer is thoroughly confusing. But the simple answer is all of Passover and the entire season is the correct time to be celebrating the resurrection of Yeshua. And then, of course, this Saturday night, we'll be doing some sort of resurrection service around Havdalah time in Mariv. So thank you for tuning in. You can send your questions. You have questions, you can send your questions to office@bethimmanuel.org. We love to hear from our long distance members. It means so much to us. So if you've got questions and you'd like to hear them addressed, I can't promise that we'll address every question, but we've got some great teachers here. and we'll take turns, and we'll see what happens.
Maybe before we finish this, Shamira says, could one combine meal of Messiah with the resurrection recognition? I know it's 6 days later, but often people get a
Yeah,
different meal of
absolutely.
Messiah.
It's a great question. So she asked, could you combine your resurrection remembrance with the meal of Messiah on the last day of Passover? And yeah, absolutely. I think that would be highly appropriate, a very, very appropriate thing to do. And in fact, it's probably, I believe the master appeared in the midst of the 12 when he had showed himself to Thomas on I think it was on the 8th day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.